Welcome back. In this video, I'd like to introduce sensory processing disorder, or SPD. Sensory processing disorder is a term that describes the differences that children and adults face when their brains are not processing sensory information adequately. Sensory processing disorder is thought to affect 5 to 16% of the population. It is typically broken into three sections: sensory modulation, sensory discrimination, and sensory-based movement. Sensory modulation is then broken into three types of responses: sensory sensitivity, sensory slow, and sensory seeking. You will also hear these called over-responsive, hyper-responsive or avoider, under-responsive or hypo-responsive, and craver. The terms will differ depending on which author you're reading and who you're listening to. Sensory processing disorder is not formally recognised as a standalone diagnosis in any of the diagnostic manuals. Despite this, the term is used as a diagnosis, which can be very confusing. Different health authorities and professionals will recognise it, whereas others won't. The updated diagnostic manuals include different responses to sensory information within the autism diagnosis, but do not include sensory processing disorder as a diagnosis in its own right. Sensory processing researchers are constantly working to find the evidence to show that this disorder can exist outside of conditions such as autism and ADHD. However, the research is just not there yet. Sensory processing was first described by Dr. Jean Ayres in the 50s and 60s. She used the term sensory integration. This term is still used by therapists today, again depending on the author or where the therapist is trained. Dr. Ayres was an occupational therapist working with children with learning disabilities in California. She had noticed that many of these children interpreted sensory messages differently to their peers. Her research indicated that the children she is working with did not integrate or combine the messages from their senses very well. This is how she started to develop her sensory integration theory. Dr. Ayres defined sensory integration as the organisation of the senses for use. By this she meant that the brain could take sensory messages received from the body, organise it, and then produce an appropriate response. We will talk more about sensory input in the next video. The term sensory processing disorder started to be used more in the 2000s. Dr. Lucy Miller and colleagues published the term in 2006. Dr. Miller had initially studied under Dr. Ayres, and her work draws heavily on Ayres' initial work and the sensory integration theory. In my opinion, however, Dr. Miller's format is easier for parents and teachers to follow, and this is why I will use it throughout my training. Both models assume the senses form the foundation for learning, as demonstrated in this diagram. The senses are at the foundation. They help with sensory motor development or movement. This facilitates perceptual motor development, or the use of the eyes and hands together, and the use of vision and hearing to interact with the world. These skills facilitate learning and engagement. However, at the foundation for these skills are the senses. In addition to her sensory integration theory, Ayres developed an assessment and treatment approach. The treatment approach is now called Ayres Sensory Integration, or Ayres SI, and it is registered as a specific treatment approach to differentiate it from others. A pure Ayres SI therapy approach will be directed by a trained therapist in a specialist clinic space. It must be child-led. The therapist will continually create opportunities at the just right level to help improve the child's sensory integration. Therapists using Ayres SI should also adhere to the fidelity guidelines outlined by Parnham and colleagues in 2011. In order to be able to use this approach adequately, therapists should have completed additional training such as the Class C modules mentioned earlier. Dr. Miller also provides training in her treatment approach, which is called a SIGRT. Her treatment approach is less purist than Ayres SI treatment, and she includes other strategies like listening therapy. Alongside this, many therapists took the concepts from Ayres sensory integration and have developed their own treatment approaches. Examples of this include weighted products, the Wilbarger brushing protocol, and sensory diets. I will refer to these as sensory supports or sensory strategies in order to differentiate them from direct SI treatment. In the next 2 levels of this training, I cover how to use and monitor these sensory supports. Many of the supports are freely available to purchase, and I hope that my training will help you to understand why they might help and also how you can use them safely and correctly. If you want to read more about a history of sensory integration, I've also included a link in the additional material to an article I've written on the GriffinOT website, which has a timeline. That brings us to the end of this video. In summary, sensory integration and sensory processing refer to the same initial idea of how the brain processes sensory messages. The terms are born from the same theory and ideas and are sometimes used interchangeably. The term sensory processing is more widely used in mainstream literature these days, but it's important to consider how the author is using the term when you're reading them. Next, we're going to explore the concept of sensory input.